So again, welcome everybody. I'm Byron. Nobody can say my last name. My mother had a hard time saying the last name, in fact. It's Belitsos. And I'm honored to be here from up north in Marin County. I didn't think this was going to happen, but Kathleen's a good friend, and she happened to bring this up. And it turns out that I gave a talk to the Ions in Petaluma, kind of the headquarters of Ions up there. And so I changed my talk for the Ions, the depth of understanding that people in Ions have. So this is actually an advanced presentation, much more than I usually do, with science and with allusions to consciousness studies and near-death studies. And then I'm going to use some sources. Some are unfamiliar, some are familiar, such as Plato, who wrote a lot about the human soul. So, the discussion is about the soul, but you can't get at something like the soul unless you kind of network in a lot of other ideas, because the soul is actually a co-creation, as I understand it. It isn't a standalone entity. Whereas in some of the traditional views, it is a standalone thing that's sort of conferred on you. And that's a very nice notion, but it isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something that evolves through your lifetime rather than something that comes into you from some other place, intact and ready to be your soul. So the soul is an evolutionary acquirement, and the soul is separate from human consciousness. Consciousness, in the broad sense, is a phenomenon of the mind. So we don't want to conflate. We don't want to confuse the mind and the soul. We also want to have a distinction between the spirit and the soul. So a lot of folks, including Plato, by the way, and all sorts of Eastern and Western notions, they confuse spirit and soul. They think of it as kind of the same thing. So they use these words interchangeably. And so much of my work in my book is to distinguish these metaphysical realities, both through appeal to science, the science of consciousness, what we know from all aspects of parapsychology, near-death studies, and consciousness studies, and other disciplines, transpersonal psychology. We're beginning to tease out these distinctions that we really need to in order to build an advanced civilization. Because if you don't kind of know what you're working with, then you may not adopt the right practices. Spiritual practices, psychological practices, healing practices depend on having good definitions of what you're working with. And what we find is there's a tremendous confusion, really. I would almost call it chaos. Because I spent some years researching the topic, just reading into the literature on what people say about the human soul. And it's all over the map. I mean, it's really kind of astonishing, so much so that in my book, I have 2 chapters of the history of the idea of the soul. So the history of the idea of the soul, East and West, you're going to see it just like zigzagging all over the place. And we come out with, in the 21st century, with not a very clear idea of what it is, although we have some interesting ideas. I mean, each of the ideas is compelling in their own way, and there's add-ons to it. So the add-on of the afterlife or reincarnation, those are not intrinsic to the definition of the soul necessarily. So I call them an add-on. So you have your soul, and are you going to come back and develop it some more, or are you going to ascend and grow your soul in an afterlife? So these are additional concepts to grapple with I'm going to get to, but we're going to emphasize this notion of resurrection just because it's Easter Sunday, and also because it really ties into what I'm talking about, which is that, in my view, we do resurrect into an afterlife, and a lot of my friends agree with that, but say, well, but then you reincarnate again. And so that's a separate question. But I think those of us that are metaphysically oriented would all agree that there's some kind of a resurrection that occurs after death. And we know that especially from near-death studies, which is a huge part of noetic inquiry is NDE study. It's now, its own field, its own discipline. It's not picked up that much by the Institute for Noetic Sciences, but that's okay because there's plenty of others working on this. There's lots of very solid scientific work. I was amazed because I was recently invited to give this advanced talk to a NDE studies conference, and I was pretty amazed at the scientific depth of the conference. They had people that spent 30 years studying near-death experience scientifically, professors of psychiatry and folks like that. So we're going to draw from some of that. So this is a kind of a synthesis of many different disciplines. And then in the overarching background of this, I use the source, as you read in the flyer, of the Urantia revelation, which I've been working with now for 4 decades, and have published a number of books on it by other people. And this is my first book that I've written about this. I'm mainly an editor and a publisher, and not so much a writer, but I decided finally to write something on this favorite subject of the human soul. So what's going to happen is I'm going to go through a lot of slides. I'm not going to take questions or comments for a bit of time. So I want to set up some foundational ideas that are from the book and from my many sources. And then a little bit later, I'm going to get into bringing forward the Urantia view of the soul, which is pretty much my view, but I've added certain findings from current sciences and current philosophy, and also transpersonal psychology, and including Jung, and maybe a little bit of Gurdjieff, if Kathleen can help us with that. Because current notions of the soul that have evolved in some of the more advanced esoteric teachings match what I'm talking about, so we can draw from those. Steiner is one of them, who has a lot of agreement with what I am saying, Rudolf Steiner, and Gurdjieff, I think so. And where the distinction of soul-spirit is maintained is important to do. So we're going to go back to the top slide, way back.
Let me just say that we have some hot water for tea in case anyone needs some more caffeinated brain power. I put non-caffeinated tea bags in it already, but if you want to add. Also, there's several more people on the way.
Good. Oh, well. What I do when I speak to groups is I summarize a lot, so anybody coming in late, they're going to get a summary. And you're going to get a summary too, because it's very important there's a lot of stuff here that it's not easy to retain. It took me a couple of years to sort of figure this out, so I don't expect you to get it in 10 minutes. So this is quite a big list. Can you see in the back row? I apologize if you can't. So this is what I call irreducibles of human nature. So again, this is the advanced presentation, so bear with me. I'm going to repeat these things, and we're going to define these things. But I mentioned that there's a distinction that I'm presenting, that I'm offering you, this distinction between mind, soul, and spirit. But there's yet another part of us, yet another one. So in this self-system, I call it the self-system, there's an entity point, which is in my view, is yet again distinct. Now, why do we have to have all these parts of the self? Why? Because they have different functions. So the first of these, irreducibles of human nature. So irreducible means ontological. You know the word? Ontological, meaning it's substantially distinct. You can't conflate it with something else. So something that's ontologically distinct is like the difference between water and air. It's a pretty different substance, right? It's different chemically, different, metaphysically different. So the notion here is that each person has a unique selfhood. This is not your consciousness. It's distinct from consciousness. It is not your soul. It's distinct from your soul. It's not your spirit. It's the part of you that organizes that. It's a self-organizing capability that is actually an entity that is God-given. So this is a theological notion, that there's a personhood that's sort of conferred on the infant, actually on the embryo. Depends on your belief system, actually, but somehow there's this unique self that if you look at people, you can see each face is really unique. The physiognomy is unique. The behavior is distinct. And it's something is distinct about each person that makes them lovable, makes them adorable. That's the beauty of the person, is this organizing principle. And it's more than a principle. It's think of it as something as fifth dimensional. That's a dimension outside of what we're in. So it's part of us that participates in this higher dimension, but which is an organizing principle from this other dimension that's in us, but also has one foot out of space and time. So this entity comes into us with two gifts that are part of it, two parts of it, two aspects of it. One aspect is something that's quite miraculous about the self. It's incredibly hard to fathom. And we call that free will, the freedom of the self, the freedom of selfhood, the freedom to choose, and that's where consciousness comes in. So when you have the consciousness of mind, which is able to perceive, that's one thing. But we need to study more than just perception. We need to study how is it that a person can choose their experience. What allows you to choose your perceptions and then choose your beliefs? That's not consciousness as such. That's a function in you that has the ability to to sense options and then say, I choose this option here. So this I choose this option, that I choose, that I will for this, is distinct from consciousness. It's distinct from the soul, distinct from the spirit. It's another kind of part of you which is always dynamic. And you see it in infants. You can see the infant sort of deciding, making little decisions. And children especially, they spontaneously make their decisions as to what they want to do. And they're not self-conscious about it. So you don't necessarily have to be self-conscious when you make a decision. You make your decisions sometimes almost automatically. But by definition, we mean by decision making, it's just enough that you have option A and option B. So the ability to discern options and then choose an option. So that comes in with the personhood. And that's what makes you distinct from an animal. Animals are great. Animals have incredible attributes, but according to this definition, animals do not have free will of the humankind. They have some freedom within a narrow purview. Of course, higher animals have more freedom, more of that. But humans have much more range of their freedom, their creativity. They can write songs. They can make movies, and that's because of this free self. The second attribute, I said there were two main attributes of this personhood, and the other is called by some self-awareness. Self-awareness. So there's again consciousness. We're doing consciousness studies in noetics, but we also need to study self-consciousness, self-awareness. Of course we do. But this is a distinct aspect of the study. So what is it that allows us to be self-aware, so self-aware that we can become sort of enlightened through self-awareness? We've got enough purview, enough grasp of what we're doing that we're not going around causing chaos. We're actually bringing beauty to the world and order, and we're perceiving the truth in our experience, and that's what comes from this gift of self-awareness. So I submit that most animals, except perhaps dolphins and elephants, do not have self-awareness, and I don't think they have the self-awareness at the level that we do. So this is another attribute that you might say is a divine attribute, divinely sourced. So what I'm saying here, we only got to the first one so far, so the first of these is the divinely sourced personhood, which has self-awareness and freedom, free will, liberty, the liberty that we say. So even since it's Easter Sunday, in the Bible it says that the humans are made in the image of God. So this divine image imago Dei in the Latin, is in the image of God. This is the image of God in you. So we can translate that as the personhood, the unique person. But it has these attributes, but it also has personality in it. There's this personality. So since we're in Los Angeles, you guys have a big focus on personality, and somebody's got charisma in front of the camera. What is that that's so special and distinct about an actor that's so so particular about them? Like, I don't know, Humphrey Bogart is such a distinct and unique personality. There'll never be another Humphrey Bogart, and that's his unique selfhood as part of this. So going to the second one. So that was personality. Second is the indwelling spirit, whatever you want to call this. And I like the term in Hinduism, which is the Atman, A-T-M-A-N, the Atman, which is understood to be a true entity, like a fragment of Brahman, right? So any of you are yoga practitioners? So this is part of yoga philosophy, is that there's an Atman in each human being, which is their spirit, and it's really is the presence of the Brahman, of deity, of God. So this notion of an indwelling spirit is a second part of the self. It's something we're going to return to. Thirdly is the immortal soul. So that's the ostensible point of my discussion here. But I have to tell you all these other things in order to understand the soul. So bear with me as we go through these irreducibles. So we're going to come back to the soul discussion. Fourth is the human intellect, consciousness, brain power, thinking, the thinking self, the feeling self also. And then finally is the body, the physical vehicle. This is a distinct part of us. Of course, it's the physical container of us. So sort of at the bottom of us is the body, which is holding the entire physical body-mind, as we say. But at the top, sort of the top end, you might say, of the self-system is the personhood, which is the metaphysical container of selfhood. And it's a systematizer of the self. So this is why we can have such a thing as enlightenment. Because it wasn't some part of the self that unifies all these parts, the arms, legs, and all these thoughts, all these feelings. Something has to be the unifier for that. What would be the unifier for the self? Would have to be something outside of space and time. So if it was something that was inside of space and time, by definition, philosophically, it couldn't unify something unless it's outside the system. So this is like outside the self system, but it's the container of the self system. So we're going to come back to these things. And I'm going to move on quickly now. This is what I call the soul synthesis hypothesis. So the soul is a synthetic, in the good sense, like organic synthesis system that is, well, let's go through the points. It's that in us which survives death. This is my premise. This is what survives death. Your soul, not your body, and actually not even your mind. But the mind is now, to some extent, parked in the soul after death. We're going to get to that some more. It's, I call it the harvest of self-transcending experiences. It's the harvest, the soul harvests your self-transcending experiences, meaning, so every time you have a cheeseburger, you're probably not transcending yourself, okay? So it's not that type of experience. But it's the experience of stepping out just a little bit from your current trajectory. Just a little bit extra, a little bit more kindness to somebody. Something tells you, I don't know this person, but I might as well show them some love, because love is a good thing. So just self-transcending small decisions like that through the day. That's what I'm saying, and others agree with me, that it's when you transcend your normal state of being with a little bit of extra oomph. That is soul, what we call soul making. We call the soul a co-creation or an alchemical synthesis. So the alchemists in the Middle Ages began to understand this with their metaphors of the synthesis of different elements alchemically, which create the self, as Jung talked about quite a bit. And the soul is like a container of different elements that get blended and then precipitate out something new. You know, they're talking in alchemy, they talk about precipitations of different substances. And the soul is like the ultimate alchemical synthesis. And what I'm suggesting is that the soul is a alchemical blend of your experience, your actual everyday experience, as it is apprehended by the higher self. So the higher self is looking down, sort of, at your experience. And it's going, oh, well, look, Byron did something self-transcending today. You know, Byron helped somebody over here in the church who needed some assistance. And I was in a hurry to set this up, but I stopped and I went over there and helped this person. And that was a little bit self-transcending. I got out of my own way to help somebody else out. So the higher self looks down at these events and says, I'm going to save that. So it hits the save button. And it saves that in and as your soul. So when it saves these things, it becomes personal, it becomes an archive. It's like a personal archive. So you're archiving the most important events of your life. But you're not doing it. It's something inside of you. You're not choosing to do this unless you're pretty enlightened. But it's sort of automatically happening inside the self. Finally, a couple more points about this is that let's say you're living just a kind of an average life, and you're doing good things. You're helping your family. You're bringing your kids up. You're going to your job. You're doing a lot of things that are functional and useful, and you're doing it all day. So that's a quantitative aspect of your life. You're doing a lot of things a lot of the time. So there's a quantitative aspect of your soul growth. It's a quantitative aspect of your soul growth because you're making a lot of decisions to do things that are decent. But there's another axis to this, and the other axis to this, I submit, is quality. It's the quality of your decisions. So there's a qualitative aspect of your life, of your decisions, that's higher qualities, higher values. So when you really take time and stop and say, you know, I'm going to help with the election. I'm going to make sure that the election is honest this year. I'm going to take out 3 months, and I'm going to work on electoral, purifying the electoral process in our county. I mean, that's a higher quality decision, isn't it? Because there's nothing in it for you, really. There's something in it for the collective. So when you make these higher quality decisions, that's in the soul. So those of you who want to attain a certain soul enlightenment want to choose a lot of quality decisions, as well as quantity. Taking care of your kids, doing that day in and day out, taking care of your kids. It's mainly quantitative, but it can also be qualitative too. So those are some more assumptions. So you're doing well. You're tracking with all this verbiage. I appreciate it. So just so you can rest a little bit, this is the famous sculptor of the thinker, and inviting you to be a thinker and to think through this. That the soul synthesis that we're speaking of, it results from daily choices based on reflection. So you're reflecting. So remember I said there's a free will part of the self. That's almost the highest part of the self. The freedom to decide, the freedom to choose. But there's more than that. You're not just going to choose, you're going to get into action once you make the choice. So a lot of people they're mainly in their intellect, and they're getting it, they're understanding it, but they're not doing it. They're not choosing well, now that I understand that I need to help to grow this church here. This church needs a rug. This church needs, better things on the walls. That would be get into action with your values. So that what we call decision action. So if you really want to grow your soul, get into this better consciousness, but then act on it. So that's the notion. And what this particular quote says, every time a man or woman makes a reflective moral choice, they immediately experience a divine invasion of the soul. So this is a premise that says that there's this divine part of the self that kind of imparts into your soul a good decision. It's literally memorialized in the soul. So we're going to define that a little bit more. And the way to do that,
Who said that quote?
that's from the Urantia Book. Let's snuck that in there. So now we're going to talk about near-death experience, and probably all of you know something about NDEs. It must be 500 books on this now that are, all pretty cool books about people having near-death experience, coming back from their experience. And so I'm kind of borrowing from that study of near-death experience, the science of this. I'm pulling from that, and we're going to kind of drop it on top of what I've been telling you to help us understand the soul. And in particular, there's something called the life review phenomenon. So this life review notion has been, the first time it really appeared in the literature was, remember Betty Eadie from back in the early 90s with the first big book on near-death experience? Remember that book, Embraced by the Light? And it was a seminal text because it was just everything was just out there. She really exploded with kind of a revelation about her near-death experience. And she said, among many other things, many things, she goes, I not only re-experience my own emotions at each moment, but I also, missing a verb there, also I perceive what others around me felt. So what she's talking about, in the afterlife experience, in some higher realm, her life flashed before her eyes. And it was presented to her systematically, sort of like a 3D movie of her life. And she saw her entire life scrolling before her. And she re-experienced her experience vividly, and she experienced what others around her felt at the same time. So this has now been discovered over the last 25 years to be a part of many NDEs, and they've got about 5,000 now documented, scientifically documented, and about 1,000 of those have this type of experience called a life review. And I personally have had a mini life review because one time as an 8-year-old I almost drowned. I was in a neighborhood pool and they pulled me out last minute. I jumped into the deep end of the neighborhood pool, swimming pool, thinking I was jumping in the shallow end. And as Kathleen knows, I always jump into the deep end. And so I was like this little kid, a scrawny, I couldn't swim. And so I was kind of drowning in the deep end. And a lifeguard pulled me out last second. And I didn't swallow water or anything, but I was totally paralyzed and sinking. And then my life flashed before my eyes. And many of you probably had this experience. And I saw like my parents, my siblings, my cat, everything just very imagistic and vivid and lit up sort of review of my life. And it was quite startling. And I forgot about it, but then I remembered much later that I'd had a life review. And so it's nothing like hers, because when these people have out-of-body life reviews. Here's what one of the scientists, Bruce Horacek, said. So what he's basically equating, or I'm equating, the life review is evidence of the presence of the soul. And almost all of these observers say that. It's not the mind, it's not the brain, right? You're outside, you're not, your brain is turned off, you're dead. So it's not the brain. It's the self that survives the body, right? And that we typically call that the soul. So the soul, this is evidence of the soul. And now I'm equating this with something I'm calling divine omniscience. Now here's the reason why it's this quote here. The NDEer, the person who experiences a near-death experience, typically reviews, sees again, and re-experiences every moment of his or her life. At the same time, the NDEer fully experiences being every other person with whom they have interacted. So you're fully experiencing being the people that you've interacted with. I mean, it includes your spouse, your kids, your parents, your friends. You're actually seeing your life through their eyes. You're seeing your life through their eyes in this experience. Now, who is orchestrating this? You know, here, I'm in Los Angeles, so who's producing this? You know, who's directing this? How can this be? How can this thing be playing in front of the eyes of these people who are out of body? And they all come back and say almost the same thing. So this guy's done a catalog of hundreds of these life review experiences. So before I get to that, he's and others have classified the NDE life review experiences. And one of the things they found out was that atheists who have NDEs, every single one of them has a life review, 100%. And I have quite a few of those who on a questionnaire said they're an atheist, but I had an out-of-body experience, I had a life review, and I saw my life go before me. So that's interesting. It's like maybe their soul wants to tell them something.
Did they remain atheists after?
No. Many of them are on the circuit speaking that were atheists before. What they found is a lot of these people had no religious background, and then they had the NDE, and now they're on spiritual mission. You know, and a lot of them are, you know, there's a few physicians, one from LA named, I forget her name, but she had a spectacular NDE, pronounced dead, dead for a while, and while dead, she had these spiritual beings come to her, sit her in a room, showed her whole life before her on these screens, and she was mangled. She was, you know, really in bad shape. Back on Earth, and it was such a huge epiphany that when she came back to her body, she took a while to heal. She's like this missionary, spiritual teacher, and there's many others. If you go to their conferences, they usually have like a dozen people, and one guy was a real hard, difficult, you know, selfish, the way he describes it, guy who capsized in a boat, was drowned, and he's like a Christian missionary. And he says, I'm not the type, but that's what I'm doing. Another one was an atheistic from LA, a surgeon who is now quite well known. Met his relatives in the afterlife, and you know, they explained to him why he turned out to be, you know, such a disliked person. And his wife disliked him, his kids just, you know, hated him, but he made all this money. So when he came back to his body, he reconciled with his wife and kids. He closed down his medical practice and is now channeling celestial beings when he goes around, gives talks. I mean, these are the kind of things that happen from these life reviews. So I want to bridge now from this, you know, pretty metaphysical subject to introduce you to my main source, the Urantia Book, and just get a little bit through that, and then we're going to come back to the science part of this. So this, I'm trying to sandwich this in because this is a key source for what I'm going to say today, and already has been. It's the Urantia Revelation. How many of you are brand new to the Urantia text? So this is this big book. It's right here. It's 2,000 plus pages. A lot of people have not heard of it. It's kind of an underground, legendary text, like, you know, like the Course in Miracles used to be. In the 70s and 80s, nobody had heard of the Course in Miracles. Now everybody's heard of it. And the Urantia Book is kind of like that. And it reads, you know, kind of like that because it's, like, who could have written this? I mean, you can't believe anybody could have written this thing. And these are some of the precepts of it. The deity is parental. So this is more biblical. It's not New Age. So in New Age, we don't think of the divine as personal. We think of it as impersonal. We think of it as a energy, right? As a force. or as consciousness, but we don't think of it as self-aware. Typically, we don't. Now think about it. Most of the New Age stuff doesn't think that the divine cares about you. You don't think that the divine being, entity, cares about you so much that it goes out to find you. It looks for you. Whoa, there you are. I'm going to help this person. It actually sends out emissaries to heal you personally. So this is more the notion in the Urantia. So it's going back to more the traditional notion of deity as self-aware deity, which we have mainly X'd out of our consciousness these days because fundamentalists have wrecked our idea of deity by making it a man with a beard who's angry and judgmental and that sort of thing. So that's the fundamentalist, both Muslim, Christian, even a Jewish notion of an angry deity or a male deity, a patriarchal, person who rules like a dictator. So that's a totally perverse notion of theology that has been sort of foisted on us, whereas actually deity is depicted in not just this text, but in many mystical texts as benign, loving, all love, all compassionate. Second, that not only are we related and connected with one another on this planet, but on all other planets. So the Urantia notion is that other planets are inhabited, and there's not just billions, but trillions of inhabited planets, inhabited by humanoid beings. And we're in brotherhood and sisterhood with them. So we don't just have this parochial planetary view. This is extraplanetary. It's universe-wide fraternity, sorority of beings. Third, that kind of my thesis today, the third big teaching, as far as I'm concerned, is that we have this experience on Earth, which is soul-making, creating a soul, evolving it through our decisions. Fourth, that deity is a unifying force. Deity has this aspect that's impersonal as well. It's personal and impersonal. It's not just personal the way the fundamentalists put it. It's not just impersonal the way the New Agers put it. It's both. It's both of these things. So deity is all things unified as well. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about Christ today. I dropped this in here for Easter. And this is the Urantia depiction of Christ. So it's completely different than what you may be used to, although it harmonizes with the Bible in many ways. But the reason I want to quote this is it's related to our notion of soul evolution, because Christ is depicted as a person who is perfectly balanced as a person, perfectly sane. And they use the word symmetry, that had a self-symmetry. So it wasn't a person who was like really extremely intellectual or really extremely emotional or very, fanatically was balanced in all of these attributes. So this is what their notion of enlightenment is that you have this symmetry of self. So you're looking for a well-rounded personality. That's how they depict Christ. And then not only that, in your virtues. So in the virtues of the self, you don't want to have too much of anything. If you're too enthusiastic, then you become fanatical. But if you're too blasé, then you lose the ability to empathize and to touch others. So here's what they say about Jesus. Jesus was surcharged with enthusiasm, but he was never fanatical. He was emotionally active, but not flighty. He was imaginative, but practical. He was courageous, but not reckless. Just stop for a minute. What in so-called Holy Week of Christianity, we have Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers, right? So when he did that, it seems like that was reckless. And some people say, well, Jesus did this reckless thing, so I can do it too. But we need to take a closer look at this incident, which is actually described in a whole chapter in the Urantia Book, what happened on Easter, on the Monday of Easter Holy Week, when that happened. But in any case, Jesus was known as prudent, but he was not cowardly. He balanced these things. He was known as sympathetic, but not sentimental. He didn't go too far with sympathy and his empathy. He was a unique personality, but he was not eccentric. We have a lot of eccentric people where I come from in Marin County. You know, we're all kind of eccentrics. And I think about that because Christ is depicted as unique and creative, definitely creative, but not like a freakish, eccentric person, because to be eccentric is to be unbalanced. You can't really become an enlightened whole person if you're overly eccentric. So I think you get the notion of the self, trying to develop yourself and your soul in a balanced way. So here now we're leaping to yet another maybe new concept to most of you. And this is in my book. So spelled out in the book. And you're being a great audience to track me with all these things. So as you're moving through all of these developments of yourself through your choices we've been talking about, making the better choices, quality choices, you're growing developmentally. So in today's psychology, we have a whole discipline of developmental psychology. And in developmental psychology, we've really come a long way in really the last 10, 15 years, because they can really track and measure how a person moves through levels of consciousness, right? So we have a lot of discussion in noetic circles of levels of consciousness, and this is one map. And this is a map that says that there are 7 circles of individuation. So this is called, in the Urantia text and elsewhere, also in Jung, cosmic individuation. Jung used the term individuation a lot. So you're individuating, meaning your unique self is self-realizing itself. And you're becoming your uniqueness, but you're not going too far to become eccentric. And so we call this circle making. Why? Because I want to get the notion that as you're progressing, all of you is progressing. Not just part of you, not just your intellect, not just your feeling life. You're not just a film producer. You know, you're not just really good at that. You're also good at being a parent. You're also good at being self-care. You know, all these things are growing together. So you have this big circle of things that you're able to encompass. So if you can do that, you can move through levels. So in this system, we say that the first level, actually we call it the 7th, we're going up to first. So at the 7th level of consciousness attainment or individuation is achieved at age 6, roughly. So at age 6, now this is a new notion, this is a revelatory idea, that the child, the growing child, is able to really make a 100% autonomous choice. The first time, so if you've brought up kids, you see a point at which your kid is really choosing what they really want and through real options that they can sense. And that's around this time. And it is believed in the Urantia system that when this happens, the child's soul is born. So that's a little different because a lot of people think that the soul is born with you, right? This says that the soul is birthed once you have achieved free will, sufficient free will to make a moral choice. And I interviewed this guy for my book who claims he remembers when this happened, that for the first time he decided to do something slightly altruistic. And he felt then something entered into him. So typically a kid is basically selfish until a certain point. When they begin to recognize they have siblings, and they can share with their siblings, for example, and they can listen to their parents and choose the right, what their parents suggest that they do. This is considered to be the moment, the first time you do that officially, is the moment when you receive the spirit self. or the, whatever you want to call this, the Atman, the indwelling spirit, comes into the child. Why? Why? Well, that's critical to our thesis, which is that this is the birth of the soul, because you cannot have soul synthesis unless there's the higher self watching you from within. So it's like a camera crew, right? So this crew comes in and it's now watching your life. And it's remember I said, this is the part of you that hits the save button every time you do make a decision, which is soul making. So prior to that, the child is not developing their soul. The child is developing other things, but not the soul. So you have to have freedom. Freedom comes with soul. So this is distinct and different from teachings that say that you come in with the soul. For example, in the Platonic tradition, which is pervasive in the West, it states that the soul reincarnates. The soul is eternal, right? The soul is eternal, and it's always reincarnating. And that's the Platonic teaching. It even came into Christianity. And there's just a little side story. This week, it was stated in the papers that the Pope abolished hell. Did you see that? It's in the New York Times and everything. It was kind of a misquote. And but where that came from, yeah, really, where that notion came from is that in Catholic doctrine, they took over the Platonic idea of the soul. And the Platonic idea of the soul is the soul's eternal. So when you die, the soul has to go somewhere because it's eternal. It can't die. Soul doesn't die. So we're going to put the soul, if you've been a bad person, you're going to put them in some place. So you have to put it, that's how that's where they got the notion of hell. It comes from Greek philosophy and other places. Egyptian thought that there was this place that the bad souls go. So the Catholics took that doctrine and they changed it a little bit, but it's kind of the old idea, this pagan idea, that the soul has to go either up or down. So it happens as a guy quoted in my book, who's a Catholic thinker. Please shut off your phones, everybody, please. He's a Catholic thinker who wrote a pretty influential book and said, we Catholics, we got this wrong. There can't be a hell. Number one, it's a primitive idea. Number two, that's pagan. You know, that the soul has to go to this place and be there forever because it's already defined as an eternal entity. And so here we're saying that no, the soul is something that has an initiation moment in the child, and then it's now growing. Now it's going to have an eternal possibility, but it doesn't have an eternal previous life by this conception. Now, later we can debate that when I get through these. And a little bit more, then we'll have a break. So as you're progressing through these circles, at adulthood, it states in this text that you get assigned an angel. So it sounds like, you know, Sunday school, but what the notion here is that when you have become a mature and responsible adult, then the universe is going to assign you your own personal seraphim who will guide you through life. And the angels are not intrusive. They cannot intrude and tell you what to do, but they can inspire you and sort of direct your thinking. Once you have the idea, an angel can intensify an idea that's a good idea. But you have to get the idea. Then they'll kind of intensify. You ever notice that happen in your life? You kind of get an idea and it's like, oh yeah, I really should do that. You know, that could be angelic influence. You first have to choose it and then they ratify it. So that happens at this third circle, a mature adult. Then the first circle is basically enlightenment. This is a person that's totally sane, totally grounded, always loving, merciful, forgiving, all these attributes, but in balance, not fanatical. And then there's another higher level, and this is something you know from Enlightenment teachings, is that the fusion with divinity, when you fuse with it, become one with it, in other words, you're you know, as we said, it's in A Course in Miracles or other teachings, the ego is completely, gone from the equation, right? So you're completely one with spirit. I call that God fusion. I'm going to skip this. This is a little bit more in the Urantia Book. And so I'm going to make bold to introduce you to the cosmology of the Urantia Book, which gives a bigger sort of canvas in which to think of your soul evolution. Because in the Urantia view of things, there's this map which states that the universe has a center. Has a center. Now, Einstein considered the idea that the universe had a center, but he rejected it. He said, well, it'd be beautiful if the universe had a center, but that isn't what the equations seem to show. But it is implied in the Big Bang, isn't it? Because the Big Bang comes out of the center. The Big Bang didn't come out of the left side of the universe. It came out of the center. So maybe there is a center of the universe. And the Urantia notion says there's a center. Not only is it like a point in space, like in the Big Bang, says there's a point in space, and everything comes out of the point in space, which is really something that a sophomore in high school could have come up with, that there was this little point, and then boom, the universe comes out of there, That's not a very inspiring view, I think. It's very mechanistic. But what if this point was a point of all consciousness, a point of all love? And what if it intended the space-time, the evolving universe would come out of it so that we could people it, so we could populate it. So it's populating the galaxies. It's the creator populating the galaxies with life, animals, and then humans, evolving life. So that's the notion. And what I'm saying here is that the cosmology it's a kind of physics. It's a physics notion that is overlaid with life. And the life then is overlaid with soul evolution. So you have your infrastructure of the cosmos, and then you have life in the cosmos, evolving life, genetic evolution. Then you have the soul making, which is the ultimate purpose. So the purpose of all of this is soul making and what I call the quest for self-perfection and more. So we're going to have a break in a minute, and we're going to stop with this slide to take a quick break. So when we come back, we'll do more Q&A. But the Urantia text tells us that the heavenly realms are vast, and the quest of the soul is to become one with the spirit self through virtuous action, through soul making. So evolving through these levels, remember I said circles, and they're like what we call sometimes circle making. You're making your circles. You're moving up into more and more unity of the self, encompassing all parts of the self through action, through decisions. And when you finally hit that place in this heavenly realm, they tell you where it is, this little place there in the afterlife is where this fulfillment happens. Sometimes it happens down here, but typically it does not. Because if it did, and if you completely fused with the spirit self, your body would combust. And the Tibetans call that the rainbow body effect, right? That the body disappears. So if somebody's walking around telling you they're enlightened, not by this definition, because enlightenment means you've gone up in flames and you've ascended to the afterlife without death. And that happened with certain teachers. Elijah, particularly in the Bible, went up in flames, right? Went up in a chariot of fire. And so that's the goal of soul evolution, according to this view, and many others too, that we want to extinguish the material self and become one with the spirit and the soul. So I'm going to leave you with that. Have a quick break, a few minutes. I'm going to reconvene, and we'll do a little bit more, and then Q&A. Thanks for being a great audience.
Thank you.